Hi guys, I'm Retro Critic here, and today we're going to review Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex. And Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex was the first PS2 Crash game, and it was the first Crash game to go to the PS2. So Naughty Dog didn't have the rights to Crash anymore, and so they sold it to a company called Traveler's Tales. Yes, that's right, that Traveler's Tales. And yes, that Traveler's Tales, the same company that made Sonic R. Yikes, this is going to be a bumpy ride, and it's going to be quite something. And so yes, Naughty Dog wanted to move on with the IP of Crash. And yes, that's right, that Traveler's Tales. The same company that produced and developed Sonic R. And oh boy, that's Sonic R. So guys, let's take a look at this game. And so guys, let's get started, let's find out, and let's see for ourselves. So the story of the game opens up where the villains in Crash Warped are in a meeting where Uka Uka is angry at their failures. So, oh god, is that the animation? Is that the graphics? And geez, the animation, and geez, and the graphics here is just outdated. And okay, I know the PS2 had better animation and had better graphics than this one, but come on. And the animation and the graphics in other PS2 games had better graphics than this game. So the villains in Crash Warped teamed up again. Engine, Dingo Dell, Dr. Nitrous Trophy, Tiny the Tiger, but are in a meeting where they're being lambasted and scorned by Uka Uka. And right where Uka Uka is going to blast them and ask for any plans, and then Engine brings up Cortex's secret project experiment and secret weapon plan. And with Engine bringing it up and putting Cortex on the spot, Cortex talks about his secret project experiment and his secret weapon plan, and then Uka Uka likes the sound of that secret weapon. And then Cortex and Uka Uka and all the other villains start their vengeance, and then the villains start doing their evil deeds again. Oh, and there's more to the story. And geez, just when you think the story ends there, and no, you're wrong, there's more. So Uka Uka suggests he unleashes the Elementals Tikis. And well, oh boy, the Elementals Tikis are basically the weather nature Tikis who, well, you guessed it, like what you see in Avatar: Last Airbender. What they do is like what Avatar: Last Airbender does, like and when he airbends, but when we do see them airbend, but instead it's in a Crash game. And so then Uka Uka unleashes the Elemental Tikis, and then Cortex says the title of the game.
Get ready to face my wrath, Crash Bandicoot!
Wow, Cortex, that's very convenient of you just saying the title of the game. And then the game cuts to Crash and Coco and just chilling around, and they're just relaxing until the weather starts chaos, and there's earthquakes, and then Aku Aku sees what's going on and notices the elementals have been released and fire erupted. And after they've been released, Aku Aku confronts Uka Uka and the elementals are introduced, and the elementals are voiced by celebrities. But those celebrities I'll get to later. I'll get to them. But for now, after Aku Aku confronts Uka Uka, and Aku Aku goes back to Crash and Coco, and he warns Crash and Coco about Uka Uka and the elementals, and that the elementals are causing this, and that they've been released. And so then Aku Aku takes Crash and Coco to a new layer, and like it's a new hub world layer, and this new layer is something, but that aside, the new layer is interesting, and the new part of that layer is that there's a new hub world and a new layer and a new hub world. And so Aku Aku takes Crash and Coco to this new layer and this new hub world. And so it's Crash, Coco, and Aku Aku to save the day again. And so Crash, Coco, and Aku Aku can save the day again. But there's more. So, okay, so like right after the longest cutscene I've ever seen in a PS2 game. And I mean it, this is the longest cutscene that I've seen in a PS2 game. And okay, so right after the cutscenes, are over, the game then starts to the hub world, and the hub world looks pretty average and generic to me. But wait, all of a sudden, there's another semi-cutscene when the game begins, but there's a semi-cutscene where there's one more cut after the game starts to begin, and like literally after the game starts to begin, the game then cuts to another cutscene. Oh my god, Jesus Christ. So, okay, wow, oh my god, another cutscene. Are you kidding me? And I'm like, when is this game going to end? But okay, this cutscene is special, and I mean this cutscene is special. Okay, so in this cutscene, then Cortex's secret weapon has been revealed, and he reveals to be this new mutant character called Crunch, and Crunch is this new villain character who was created by Cortex, and Cortex was this new experiment he created, and this new villain is called Crunch, and Crunch is basically a replacement of Crash, and Crash was originally going to be his leader of his mutant army, and Cortex created Crunch to be his backup instead, and now Crunch is the leader of Cortex's mutant army, and now Crunch is the leader of Crunch is like the anti-Crash, and I say he's the anti-Crash because he's like literally the evil version of Crash, and he's like literally the evil version of Crash. And Crunch is a super mutant, and he's a big, strong, muscly mutant character. And the right to fight Crash. And right there, they're going to fight Crash. And Crash will start to fight Crash. And Crash meets Crunch. And Crash faces up against Crash. And Crash faces up against Crunch. And then Crash starts his adventure. And then Crash starts his adventure. And then Crash does his journey. And then Crash does his journey. So we were then introduced to Crunch, which I'm like, thank God. And then I'm like, okay, we're fine. Okay, finally, now it's about time. So then we are introduced to Crunch. And then Cortex warns about Crunch.
My days are being spent on something much more intriguing. Meet Crunch, my newest creation.
This is the creature who keeps sabotaging your master plan? Ha! You gotta be kidding. I'll exterminate this field rat in no time.
Isn't he brilliant? A testament to my true scientific genius. A real Bandicoot warrior. Unlike you, Crash. Oh well, we all make mistakes. Ta-ta for now.
Now it's finally all over, we can finally start now. All the cutscenes. Now all the cutscenes. Now it's finally all over, oh my god, thank God. And now we can finally start, oh my god, thank God. So I would like to mention the Elemental voice actors. So what's interesting is what the Elementals are voiced by. And so let me tell you, they're voice actors, and they're voiced by these celebrities. So Jess Harnell, who voiced Wacko from Animaniacs, and here he voices the Air Tiki, and Lee R. Ermey, who plays the Sergeant from Full Metal Jacket, and also many other movies he's in, other films and other things and other stuff. Here he voices the Water Tiki. Mark Hamill, who plays Luke Skywalker, and yes, he even voiced the Joker, and yes, that's right, he voices the Joker at one time, and he's in many other movies and he's in other cartoons. And here he voices the Fire Tiki. Tom Wilson, who plays Biff from Back to the Future and many other movies, and other films, and other TV shows, and even voiced a few characters, and voiced other characters in a few other cartoons. And here he voices the Rock Tiki. And I can't believe they got like people like Jess Harnell, who voices the Air Tiki here. I cannot believe they got that guy here. And I can't believe they got people like Lee R. Ermey, who voices the Water Tiki here. I cannot believe they got that guy here of all people. And I cannot believe they got people like Mark Hamill, who voices the Fire Tiki here. I cannot believe they got him of all people here. And I cannot believe they got people like Tom Wilson, who voices the Rock Tiki here. I cannot believe they got that guy of all people here in this game. They got like these celebrities in this game. And that was the celebrities, and that's who they're voiced by, the Elementals. And that's the Elementals. Oh, and Crunch is voiced by this guy. And when I heard Crunch's voice, I always knew he sounded familiar. Kevin Michael Richardson, who voiced Captain Gatu from Lilo and Stitch and many other characters, and who voices Crunch here. And here, his voice for Crunch is good here, and that was who Crunch was voiced by. And the hub world of the game starts, and the hub world is very bland and generic, but it is decent when you actually play it. And the hub world of the game starts, and the hub world is very bland and generic here, but it is decent when you actually play it. Here. So now onto the gameplay. And the gameplay is this, and here we go, and here's what I think. Okay, so now onto the gameplay. And the gameplay, we'll get to that. We'll get to. Let's get started, let's get ready. Okay, so now onto the gameplay. And the gameplay, we'll get to. And let's get started, and let's get ready. So the game has 5 worlds to explore, and an X world to explore also as well. So the game has 5 worlds to explore, and an X world to explore also as well. So that would make it about 6 worlds to explore in the game, and that's how many in all the worlds in total. So that would make it about 6 worlds to explore in the game, and that's how many in all the worlds in total. So the game has 5 worlds to explore, and an extra world to explore also as well. So that would make the game have 6 worlds to explore in the game, and that's how many in all the worlds in total. So each world is like, well, the Elementals worlds, like in Avatar when they airbend. But here it's the air, fire, earth, and water worlds in the game, and like in Avatar when they airbend. But here, it's the air, fire, earth, and water worlds in the game, and the worlds in the game are like the Elementals worlds, and the worlds are also have a space and a space station and layer and area worlds, and like the worlds are also have a space and space station and worlds and layer and areas worlds, and that's kind of the worlds to go into the worlds here, and that's kind of the worlds go into the worlds here, of the worlds. So now the gameplay, and the gameplay is decent. So, okay, the gameplay, and here's what I think about the gameplay. So here's what I think about the gameplay, and so the gameplay is decent, and the gameplay is very mediocre, and really, when I say that, I mean it. And like literally the gameplay is really mediocre here. And literally I mean it when I say it, but that's how much that kind of style that this is. I mean that this kind of game this game kind of is. And that's my thoughts on the gameplay, and that's my thoughts. So the gameplay is just very generic in this game. And other times the controls feels clunky and slippery every time I move Crash. And the gameplay is just very generic and average play. And it's just average to play, and every time I move Crash, the controls feels clunky and slippery at times, and even a lot of times it feels odd. So like the gameplay is just odd, and many times the controls feels like it's cluster and jumpy. And it's very strange every time I move Crash. And it's strange, and the controls are cluster and jumpy every time when I move Crash. So the controls in the game are off, but still, you'll get used to the controls. And well, I got used to the controls in the game. And the controls are mediocre to say the least when you play this game. So the controls in the game are off, but still, you get used to the controls. And well, I got used to the controls in the game. And the controls are mediocre to say the least when you play this game. The levels of the game are like your standard Crash level. And in fact, it's like any other Crash game level. And it has decent levels, and like the levels are very typical, and the levels are okay, and the levels feels like it's trying too hard to throw enemies at you and have obstacles at you, and the enemies being thrown at you are not that effective, and they're not much a threat to you. Well, that depends. And when you confront the obstacles of the game, they're not that effective, and they're not much to a threat to you. And well, that just depends really when you play the game. The levels of the game are like your standard Crash level, and in fact, it's like any other Crash game level. And it has decent levels, and like the levels are very typical, and the levels are okay, and the levels feel like it's trying too hard to throw enemies at you and have obstacles at you. You know, so hard to have enemies at you. And the enemies being thrown at you are not that effective, and they're not much to a threat to you. Well, that depends. And when you confront the obstacles in the game, they're not that effective, and they're not much to a threat. They're not much a threat to you. And well, that just depends actually when you play the game, when you really think about it. So the levels are overall actually pretty decent to play, and the levels are actually pretty good to play, and the levels are kind of challenging, and like it can be hard at some times, but not really, like, because they're not that difficult and hard as you play them. And when you play the levels, trust me, you'll get used to it, and it took a while for me to get used to it, and it did took me a while to get used to it, and you will get used to it as you play it. And overall, the levels are fine. The levels are not the best, and they're not really good levels, really, and like the levels are not really the best level play, and they're really not good levels, and the levels that are just fine, and they're just average, and like they're really just average levels, and they're just fine. So the levels are overall actually pretty decent to play, and the levels are actually pretty good to play, and the levels are kind of challenging, and like it can be hard at sometimes, but not really, because they're not that difficult and hard as you play them. And when you play the levels, trust me, you'll get used to it. And it took me a while. It took a while for me to get used to it, and it did took me a while to get used to it, and you get used to it as you play it. And overall, the levels are fine, and the levels are not the best, and they're really not good levels, really. And like the levels are not really the best to play, and they're not good levels, really. And like the levels are not really the best to play, and they're really not good levels, and the levels are just fine, and they're just average, and they're really just average, and they're just fine, and it's okay, and they're fine, they're really just okay. So then there are levels which are literally trying to be like Crash 3, and boy, is this game trying to be like Crash 3. And let me tell you something, there was one level in the game where like Crash is climbing on the stool, and when he climbs the stool, it's really slow, and I mean it, and I mean really slow. And when Crash climbs the stool in this game, it's so ridiculously slow. And speaking of when Crash climbs, that reminds me of Crash 3, of when he climbs in Crash 3. And so when Crash climbs in Crash 3, it's a lot better, and in fact, I would say it's a lot more easier in that game. And like when Crash climbs in Crash 3, it's way more easier in that game. It's so much better the way he does it, and I'm like, why can't in this game Crash can't even climb well in this game? Like seriously, it's embarrassing that Crash climbs slow in this game. That it makes its previous game look good. Like, it makes the predecessor look very good, and I know this is a next-gen game at the time, but well, the problem is with that is that it's a next-gen game, and it should have improved. Like, it should improve in its predecessor, in its previous console. And you're supposed to make it better, and you're supposed to make the next console way more better than the previous console in this game. And this game should have been better, and it should have been a lot more better, especially in this game. And now, I want to talk about that machine that Crash goes on. And yeah, you know that machine in the front cover of the game. And it's the machine that Crash goes on, and it's the yellow machine that's the first cover, that's the front cover in the game. And yeah, that machine, and yeah, that machine. And so this yellow machine that you hop on is actually okay in a few areas, but still, it's awful. Like, for example, when I target, the targeting is awful. Like, the targeting in this game is making Crash 3 look more good than it is. And that's how bad that targeting is in this game. And, like, I don't understand why in Crash 3 the targeting was so good, but in this game, the targeting is so horrendous that I would vomit. And, like, seriously, when you target, it's very hard in the way you do it. And when I target it in the yellow machine, I can't barely target. And, like, it's hard to target in my position, and it's hard to position my target on focus. Like, it's hard to focus my target, and overall the yellow machine you hop on, and like when you move it, it's okay in a few areas, but that's about it. But that's not saying much, and it's really just okay. That's about it. And it's really just okay, and it's just so okay that's bland and dull, and like in fact it's bland and dull when I come to think about it. So now there are the warp screen scenes, and where what's considered to be the warp screen scenes, the warp screen are this. What's considered to be a warp screen, and these scenes are like the warp scenes in Crash 3, and like, and these scenes are similar to Crash 3, and like Crash 3, they show scenes of the villain's boss fight, and they show their threats and insults at you, and boy, this game is similar, and really trying so hard to be like Crash 3, and so in these warp scenes, it shows the villain's boss fights, and they show you their threats and insults.
Crash! Leave them for Tiny, or Crash get crushed! Tiny, take them back! In Gladiator Arena!
So give me the goods and shove off, or I'll roast yous. Right, now you've gone and done it. Them crystals are mine.
And the villains, they were intimidating, threatening in Crash 3, and when you were about to fight the bosses, they give you scary lines, and they would come off as if they would kick your ass. And when you're about to fight the bosses, they would give you scary lines, because in Crash 3, they had bosses that would come off and kick your ass. That's the problem. But in this game, it's actually here. The warp scenes have crunch, and the tiki masks, and I'm like, I'm okay with that. I'm like, okay, they can be at least intimidating, threatening, maybe they're threatening. Let's see how they are, and let's see how they are.
You want a piece of me, Bandicoot? Huh? Huh? Do ya? Huh? Wuss. Oh, I'm gonna shake, rattle, and roll your Bandicoot butt.
Is there a draft in here? Not used to the weather here, I a wimp.
And oh Jesus, they're just embarrassing. And they're just laughably bad, and oh Jesus, they're just embarrassing, and they're just laughably bad. And I just feel bad here. I mean, what was that? I mean, I just feel bad here. I mean, what was that? And okay, so the crunch and the tiki masks might be imitating in a few places and maybe threatening, but in a few areas. And like when I see crunches and the tiki masks, they look like they come off as cartoonish and silly, and they're just kind of ridiculous, and they're just kind of cheesy.
Bring it!
So, okay, now the bosses in the game. And in the boss fights, they're just kind of bad, and the bosses here are kind of a joke, but first the rock boss with Crunch and the fire boss with Crunch are kind of mediocre in challenging them. And they're kind of generic and lame and easy boss fights, and they are easy boss fights they are. But now, when it comes to the water boss fight, when it comes to the water boss with Crunch, I actually think it's in between. And like, it's in the middle, and I just think that, yes, it's not that much challenging, but at the same time, it is way too much easy, but still, I actually enjoy it. And like, I actually pretty much had fun with this boss. And now, when it comes to the air boss fight with Crunch, it's incredible. Like, it's one of the only few boss fights that's worth a damn, and it's almost like they put effort into this boss fight. And in fact, this has to be one of my favorite boss fights in this game, in the game, and yes, even the whole franchise too. And when it comes down to this boss fight, yes, it's challenging, and it can be hard at some times, and many times it can be enjoyable and actually fun to beat this boss fight. And that's what I think about the bosses in this game, and that's my thoughts on the bosses in this game. So overall, I do think the boss fights are mediocre, with one exception. And maybe another one, too. And I think the boss fights are just generic, except for one, and maybe another one. And first of all, I think the rock boss fight with Crunch is just horrendous and just plain bad. And there's no challenge, and there's nothing challenging, and there's nothing challenging about it. And well, it's just easy and bland, and it can be repetitive, and many times it can be annoying. And it drags on, and it is just a terrible boss fight. And it's just a terrible boss fight. And now there's the fire boss fight with Crunch, and this one could have potential. And this one could have potential. And this one could have potential. I mean, it's too repetitive. And this one could have potential. And it would have potential. And the problem is that the way it's challenging is a little off. And it's too repetitive. And it's kind of hard, but not really. And it's just a dull and boring boss fight. And I think it's just a bad boss fight. And I think this boss fight is just lame. And now there's the water boss fight with Crunch. And now this can be challenging at some times, and many times it's really not that hard, but really I just like this boss fight. And sure it's okay, and well, it's fine, and well, maybe way too easy, and sure it's okay, and sure it's fine, and sure it's way too easy. But really, I actually enjoyed this boss fight, and I had fun with this boss fight. And I had some fun with this boss fight. And I just like this boss fight. I don't know, that's just me. And now there's the air boss fight with Crunch. And this boss fight has to be the best boss fight in this whole game. And this is one of my favorite in the whole series, in the whole entire series. This is one of my favorite in the whole entire series, and yes, the whole entire franchise in the series. This is one of my favorite in the whole entire franchise, in the whole entire series. And that's because this boss fight can be challenging, and it can be pretty hard once in a while. And this boss fight felt like they gave a damn, and they actually put some effort into this one. And they made this boss fight, and they made this boss pretty tough, and it can be risky once in a while. And this boss fight can actually be enjoyable, and this boss fight can actually be fun. And so that's what I think about the bosses in this game, and so that's my thoughts on the bosses of this game. So now there are more of the levels. Okay, now more about the levels. You see there is this water levels, which is terrible. And this water level is so bad that I'm going to puke. And yes, it's that bad. And it's the most worst water level I ever seen in my life. And now Crash 3's water levels were very good. Water levels were very good. And I feel like this game is trying to copy Crash 3. I feel like this game is trying to copy Crash 3's water levels. It's almost like it wants to be like Crash 3 at times. And it fails. And it's like it's trying to be better and more better and fails. And this game's water, and I feel like it's trying to be more better than Crash 3. I feel like it's trying to be more better than Crash 3, but fails. And this game's water levels are just infamous, and like these water levels are so infamous that Crash fans make fun of these water levels. And like these fans are known to make fun of these water levels, and that these fans are known to make fun of these water levels because they're just so bad. And the fans were right. These water levels are terrible. And yes, the fans can be right. The fans can be right here. The water levels here are horrible, and they're just really very horrible. Like in these water levels, you can barely move your sub. And in the water levels, you can barely shoot your target. And so like in the water levels, when you ride your sub, and as you're riding your sub, you can barely move your sub. And you can barely shoot your target, and the way you shoot in your sub is just lazy. And like the way you shoot in your sub is just unbearable. And when you shoot, it's just laughable. When you shoot, it's laughable here. And when you start the shooting, it's embarrassing here. And the shooting is just lame here, and the shooting's just bad here. And when you move your sub, it's so slow. And it's like when you move your sub, it's so slow to move here. And yes, it's that bad. And these water levels are just embarrassing and laughable. And the water levels are just the worst here. And they have to be the most shittiest thing I ever seen in this game. And that was the water levels. And that's my thoughts on the water levels, and that's all what I have to say about the water levels. So now, onto more of the levels, and now here's some more about the levels, and now there is the castle levels, and they're kind of generic. And they can be a bit hard at sometimes, and I'm not going to lie, these castle levels are not that bad. And these levels are pretty good, and I actually like the castle levels here, and the castle levels are pretty good here. And I actually like the castle levels here, but really, yes, it could be like your typical and generic Crash level, in your typical Crash level. But at the same time, the castle levels can be a bit hard at some times, and the castle levels are very challenging in some parts in the castle levels. Yes, they can be kind of challenging at some parts for the most part of that. But that's about it. And that's about it. And so the castle levels are interesting to say the least, and the castle levels are kind of enjoyable to play. And like, I do find the castle levels interesting to say the least, and the castle levels are kind of enjoyable to play. And the castle levels can be strange at sometimes, and have some odd parts to it. And the castle levels are really just average to play, and they're just okay to play. And the castle levels can be strange sometimes, and have some odd parts to it. And the castle levels are really just average to play, and they're just okay to play. And that's my thoughts on that. That's all I have to say on that front. On to the moves, and the moves are okay. And so I think that the bazooka move is still cool in the game, and the bazooka is still a good move in the game. And the only problem is the targeting, and the only problem I have is the targeting. And the bazooka is final roll, and I think the bazooka is good overall, and the bazooka is good overall. And the bazooka is just good overall. So the moves are okay here, and I think they're good. I think they're good and average, and the moves are just somewhat decent in this game. And the bazooka move is actually a pretty good move to use in the game, and the bazooka move is kind of still cool to use in the game, and still. And the only problem I have is the way you position your targeting, and targeting is just bad, and it's just bad and clunky. And my only problem is that I have, and the only problem that I have is the aiming of your targeting is just awful. The aiming of targeting is just awful, and it's floaty in the way I move it. The aiming of your target, and it's just awful. And that's pretty much the issue with that. And the bazooka is final roll, and the bazooka is good overall. I mean, I think it's a good move overall. It's a final roll. It's decent. Yeah. And the bazooka's fine. Final roll. It's decent. And the bazooka move is final roll, and the bazooka move is final roll, and the bazooka move is fine. And so now onto the tiptoe move. And this move is oh boy special. And when I say that, it's oh boy special. And this move is this tiptoe move is like what it sounds. It's basically like you have to tiptoe your way through the nukes crates boxes and explosive crate boxes, and that's kind of. So now, like, seriously, the way you tiptoe your move, it's like seriously the way you tiptoe, and seriously like the way you tiptoe your way through the nuke crate boxes and explosive crate boxes, and when you tiptoe, it's ridiculous. You can easily die from the explosive boxes. And when you tiptoe, it can be slippery, and when you tiptoe, it's so slow to move, and in fact, when you tiptoe, it's hard to literally move. And it's the hardest, and it's the hardest move I ever. And moving is just difficult and hard, and moving it just challenging. And it's shitty to move it. And it's shitty to move it that you move in the first place. And that's how bad that move is. Okay, like that's just how bad that move is. And so really, there is a space levels and a space station levels, and castle levels, and water levels, and jungle levels, and racing levels, and car levels, and cave levels, and these levels with the cars are just annoying, and the racing levels are just terrible and awful and clunky and floaty to move them, and in the way you move them, I mean, I don't know, and they're just lame, and they're lame and bland, and most of the levels are like trying to be like Crash 3, and these levels are like trying to be like Crash 3, and these levels are average and trying to copy Crash 3, and it's like we're literally trying to copy Crash 3 here. And when it's trying so hard to be like Crash 3, and it's like trying to be Crash 3 here. And it's okay, and it's just decent in a few parts, and good in a few parts, but that's about it. So there is like a space levels, and a space station levels, and castle levels, and water levels, and jungle levels, and racing levels, and car levels, and cave levels, and these levels with the cars are just annoying. And racing levels are just terrible here, and awful, and clunky and floaty to move them. And in the way you move them, and they're lame, and they're just like, and bland, and most of the levels are like trying to be like Crash 3, and these levels are like, and it's like trying so hard to be like Crash 3. And these levels are average and trying to copy Crash 3. And Went's trying so hard to be like Crash 3, and I mean, and it's okay, and it's just decent in a few parts, and it's also good in a few parts, but that's about it, really, in the game. Or they're basically obstacles in the levels, and they're literally inside the levels. Yes, that's right, Tiny the Tiger and Trophy are enemies. The Dingle Dial. And Tiny the Tiger is an obstacle, and Dingle Dial and Entropy just shoot at you. Engine just appears only in racing levels, and that's really about it. It's just fucking embarrassing. And it's just kind of fucking embarrassing, really, when you think about it. I mean, oh my god. And, oh god, I don't know what to say. So I shit you not, Dingle Dial and Entropy and Tiger are enemies in the game, and like, Tiny Tiger is just literally an obstacle you just pass by in the game. Dingle Dial and Entropy just shoot at you. They just shoot at you, and Engine just doesn't even appear in the levels. He just only appears in the car levels. Oh my god. Engine, Entropy, Tiny Tiger, and Dingle Dial are just enemies. They're just enemies in the game. They're just enemies in the game. And Tiny Tiger is just an obstacle. He's like literally just an obstacle you just pass by and encounter in the game. And Dingle Dial and Entropy just shoot at you. They just shoot at you in the game. And Entropy doesn't even appear in the and Engine just doesn't even appear in the levels. He just only appears in the car levels. Oh my god, jeez. And I mean, how lazy and pathetic can you get? I mean, the idea that the villains and bosses from Crash 3 are now reduced to enemies, or I guess obstacles in a level, and literally in a level, is kind of sad and annoying. I mean, you know, Tiny Tiger and Engine and Entropy and Dingle Dial are obstacles and enemies? Oh my god. Are obstacles an enemy? And the idea that the villains and bosses from Crash 3 are now just enemies or like obstacles in a level and literally inside a level, it's just disrespectful and kind of a joke here. But oh well, at least they became villains and bosses again in later games. And oh well, at least they become villains and bosses again in later games. And I mean, just the idea that Entropy and oh my god, freaking and the idea that like I don't know, Tiny the Tiger, Dingle Dial are reduced to this. Like, Dingle Dial's not... Tiny Dial's an obstacle. They're enemies that shooting... how fucking pathetic is that? But the fact that, like, Tiny the Tiger is just an obstacle that you pass by and encounter. Like, I'm not kidding. The fact that Tiny the Tiger is just an obstacle that you pass by and just encounter in front. And the fact that Engine and... The Dingle Dial and Trophy are just people who shoot at you. And it's... Shoot Dingle and Trophy and Engine is just in car level sometimes. It's just pathetic to me. I mean, the idea that Entropy and Dingle just are enemies that shoot, is just pathetic to me. I mean, the idea that Entropy and Dingle Dial, and Dingle Dial are just enemies to shoot at you. I mean, they're just enemies to shoot at me. How pathetic and sad is that? An Engine who's not even in the levels, just only appears in the car levels, just sad and pathetic. And the idea that Engine, who's not even in the levels, but only in the car levels, are just sad and pathetic to me. Oh my god. And so now... And at least in later games, they learn to use them more and to have them as villains and bosses again in future games, and to have more of a rule at least. And at least in later games, they learn to use them more to have them as villains and bosses again in future games, and to have more of a role at least. So like the game is fine overall, I guess. I honestly have mixed feelings on this game, but now on to the ending of the game. And the ending of the game is quite interesting. It's something I'll tell you that, to say the least. And so on and so forth. And I'll go on. So then Crash confronts Cortex and Uka Uka, and then Cortex and Uka Uka unleashes Crunch at him, and they release the elementals on Crash. So then Crash fights Crunch, and then at the same time he also has to fight the elementals. And I gotta say, this is the most crappiest boss fight I ever played in my life. And half the time, it's kind of easy, and Crash fights them kind of easily. And then at the same time, he also has to fight the elementals, and I gotta say, this is the most crappiest boss fight I ever played in my life. And half the time, it's kind of easy. And when Crash fights Crunch, it's kind of easy, and the boss fight is the most shittiest boss fight I've ever seen. And the elementals are the most crappiest, are the most sloppy, and the most ridiculous boss fight I ever played in my life. I ever seen in my life. And the elementals are the most crappiest, are the most sloppy, and the most ridiculous boss fight I ever played in my life. I ever seen. So then Crash defeats and destroys Crunch, and then he defeats and destroys the elementals, and when you also have to fight Cortex and Uka Uka, and well, Cortex and Uka Uka are also a very easy boss fight, and it's very easy to hit them and attack And Cortex and Uka Uka, the thing is, and here's what I think, and Cortex and Uka Uka are a very lame boss fight, and they're kind of pathetic and crap, and that boss fight is okay and average, and that's what I have to say and what I think about that boss fight. And Crash defeats and destroys Cortex and Uka Uka. And Crash defeats and destroys them all, and all of them. And pretty much everyone. Then it cuts to a scene where Cortex fails and cries and begs for mercy. And Uka Uka is angry at Cortex's failures. And Cortex freaks out and Uka Uka is angry. And so it cuts to this scene where then it shows that Crunch was under control by a chip on his head. And let me get this straight. He was under control by a chip on his head, and nobody realized and knew, and he was under control by a chip on his head. And interesting, he was under control by on his head. Interesting. And that explains it, and then Crunch reveals he's actually a good guy to Crash, and Uka Uka, Crash, and Aku Aku. And Crunch tries to show that he's a good guy, and all of a sudden the space station is about to explode, and Cortex freaks out, and Uka Uka gets mad at Cortex again. Uka Uka is mad, and Cortex freaks out, and they run away and escape, and Uka Uka gets mad at Cortex, Cortex freaks out, and they run away and escape, and then Crash and Aku Aku and Crunch also run away and escape, and then the space station starts to explode, and it's about to blow, and then Crash and Aku Aku and Crunch also run away and escape, and then Coco saves and rescues them. And then the space station explodes and is destroyed. So then we cut to a scene where Crash and Aku Aku and Coco and Crunch are at their home. And their Crash and Coco and Aku Aku and Crunch are in their home now. And Crunch explains that he was under mind control by a chip on his head. And yes, that's right, a chip on his head being under mind control by Cortex. And Crunch reveals that he's a good guy, that he wants to join the team, and that he wants to join the group. And then Crash and Coco and Aku Aku accept Crunch as a friend and a part of the family. So then it gets to this scene where now it reveals where Cortex and Uka Uka are. And now it shows that Cortex is running for his life, where Uka Uka is so angry that he's zapping at Cortex in the Atlantic snow on an iceberg. And Uka Uka is angry that they're stranded and lost. And now it shows that Cortex is running for his life, where Uka Uka is so angry that he's zapping Cortex in the Atlantic snow on an iceberg. And Uka Uka is angry that they're stranded and lost, and Cortex runs away for his life. And that they're lost in the middle of nowhere. And Cortex runs away for his life, where Uka Uka is so angry that they're stranded nowhere. And so then we're to assume that Cortex and Uka Uka are dead and gone. Might maybe appear in the next game, and we're here to assume about their fate. And even though they might maybe appear in the next game, and that they might maybe be dying out there, and that they might maybe be lost forever. And so then the game finally ends. And actually that was finally the ending of the game. And then the game finally ends. And then the game finally ends. And so that was Crash, the Wrath of Cortex. And so that was Crash Bandicoot, the Wrath of Cortex. And that's my thoughts on Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex. So that was Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex. And well, even though it is clearly not a perfect game, and I actually do still like it, and I do honestly have mixed feelings about it. And I actually do think it's a okay game. And overall, even though it's not the greatest Crash game out there, and with its flaws and errors, and I do think Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex is an average game, and overall I do think it's a fine game, and it's a mediocre game. And so guys, that was Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex. It's not really the greatest, nor is it the best. It wasn't perfect. Now with its flaws and its errors, it's actually a decent game. I think it's average. I think it's decent. I think it's an okay game when you play it. I actually still think it's actually a pretty good game when you actually play it. So guys, that was Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex. And that's what I think about Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex. And those are my thoughts on Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex. So guys, I'm Retro Critic, and I'm out. And I'll see you guys later. I'll see you guys in the next video. And I'll see you guys next time. And I'll see you guys around. And peace out. And bye.